On the night of June 5, 1944, the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe sat in a trailer outside Portsmouth and wrote a short note in pencil. He folded it, he put it in his wallet. The note said, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Le Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the navy did all the bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He never had to read that note again, but he carried it for the rest of the war. This is the story of Normandy, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, the moment the Western Allies came back to a continent they had been driven off 4 years earlier, and the battle that, alongside the Eastern Front, sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. It is a story about deception, about weather, about the difference between what a battle is supposed to look like and what it actually looks like when the ramps drop. I am Benito, and this is the Jacked Historian channel. Since 1941, Stalin had been demanding a second front. He demanded it in letters, he demanded it in cables, he demanded it at every meeting where his ambassadors were allowed to ask for things. And what he wanted was simple. The Red Army was bleeding. Every month, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers died on the Eastern Front. The British and the Americans were not bleeding. He wanted them to start. By 1943, the bill was overdue. Roosevelt and Churchill had spent 18 months explaining Stalin why a cross-channel invasion was not yet possible. Stalin had spent 18 months not believing them. He suspected that his allies were perfectly happy to let the Soviets and the Germans destroy each other on the Eastern Front while they waited out the war from a comfortable distance. He was not entirely wrong. What the Allies did instead was the Mediterranean, North Africa first, then Sicily in the summer of 1943, then going up from southern Italy that same fall. Churchill called it the soft underbelly of Europe. It was a good phrase. It was also a lie. The Italian peninsula turned out to be a vertical defensive nightmare of mountains and rivers. And by the spring of 1944, the Allies were grinding up the peninsula one ridge at a time, taking heavy casualties for tiny strategic gains. It became clear finally that the war in Europe would not be won in Italy. It would be won in France, or not at all. In November 1943, the three leaders met for the first time in Tehran: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. The most consequential meeting of the war, and there, after years of evasion, the Western Allies finally committed. The invasion of France would happen in May 1944. It was given a name: Operation Overlord. Nobody at the table fully understood what they had just committed to. Nobody had ever done what they were proposing. The largest amphibious assault in history up to that point had been the Sicily landings, which had put roughly 150,000 men ashore over several days against light resistance. Overlord would put more than that in a single morning against the most heavily fortified coastline in Europe. Command of Operation Overlord went to Dwight David Eisenhower. He had never commanded troops in serious combat. He had spent most of his career as a staff officer. He was instead a coalition manager. Anglo-American command relations were genuinely toxic, screaming matches in conference rooms, threatened resignations. Montgomery openly disdaining American generals, Bradley and others viewing Montgomery as a condescending and dismissing individual. Eisenhower's actual day-to-day job was managing these feuds so that the alliance did not fall apart. He could absorb pressure from Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin without breaking. He could make decisions and own them. For what Overlord required, keeping 100 quarreling personalities pointed in the same direction, Eisenhower was exactly the right man. His ground commander was Bernard Law Montgomery. Also vain, prickly, and almost completely unloved by every American general above the rank of colonel. Eisenhower spent much of the planning of Overlord apologizing for Montgomery to people Montgomery had insulted. He would spend even more time doing it after the invasion. The compensating fact was that Montgomery was usually right. Not always, but more often than the people who hated him. The American ground commander was Omar Bradley, quiet, professional, almost invisible next to Montgomery. He was the anti-Montgomery. The papers called him the GI's general because he looked and talked like an ordinary American. He was also the man who would in the end deliver the breakout. On the German side, in late 1943, Hitler placed the defense of France in the hands of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the most famous and most popular general of the war. Rommel had been beaten in North Africa by Allied power, air power, and superior logistics. He had taken a lesson the rest of German high command had not. He knew what was coming. In a letter to his wife that winter, he wrote, "If they get ashore, we have lost the war." And he believed it. He was exactly right. But before any of this, before the boats and the bombs and the men, there was a problem the Allies had to solve. The problem was geography. France has a long coastline. The Germans could not be strong everywhere. The Allies had to convince them to mass their force in the wrong place, specifically at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the channel, the most obvious invasion route, while the real attack came at Normandy. What followed was the most successful deception campaign in the history of war. It was called Operation Bodyguard. The component aimed at Normandy and Calais. The part of it that mattered for June 6th was Operation Fortitude. Its centerpiece was a fictional army group, the 1st U.S. Army Group, or in its acronym, FUSAG, supposedly commanded by George Patton and supposedly massing in the southeast England for the invasion of Calais. FUSAG had inflatable rubber tanks. It had cardboard landing craft, fake radio traffic generated by a handful of signalmen working 16-hour days, and it had an entire imaginary order of battle that German intelligence pieced together with great care over many months. Of course, it did not exist. To make the deception convincing, the Allies turned every German spy operating in Britain, every single one. MI5 had identified, captured, and either executed or flipped them. The survivors were now feeding controlled lies back to Berlin. The Germans believed they had a network of reliable informants. They had, in fact, a network of British case officers writing very plausible reports for them. And the Germans believed it. On June 6th, when the invasion came, and for weeks after that, they believed it. The German 15th Army, 20-some divisions, the most powerful concentration of force in France, sat at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for the real invasion to begin. While the real invasion was already drowning in Normandy, it is one of the most extraordinary facts of the campaign. The Allies won at the beaches partly because the Germans were not at the beaches. The Germans had been building the Atlantic Wall for 3 years. Concrete bunkers, casemated gun positions, beach obstacles, belts of mines running for miles inland. On paper, it was a fortress stretching from northern Norway to the Spanish border. In reality, it was mostly a fortress in the imagination of Nazi propagandists. The strongest sections, the deepest bunkers, the heaviest guns, the densest minefields were concentrated in one spot, and you can guess, it was Pas-de-Calais, where the Germans expected the blow to fall. Normandy was, by comparison, weaker. Not undefended, but weaker. The Germans, in other words, had built the wrong wall. Even so, what they had built was real, and how to fight from it was the subject of an argument inside the German High Command. The argument in the end helped lose them the battle before it began. The argument was between two men, Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior field marshal in the West, 68 years old, an aristocrat of the old Prussian schools and veteran for half a century. His position was the orthodox doctrine of armored warfare. Keep your panzers reserves inland, well back from the coast. Let the enemy land, let him push inland, away from his naval guns. Let him outrun his supply, then strike with the full weight of every panzer division you have and drive him back into the sea. Erwin Rommel was junior to Rundstedt in rank, but more famous and more recently bloodied, and reporting directly to Hitler on matters of beach defense. He had seen what Allied air power did in North Africa. He had watched his own armored columns destroyed on the road by fighter bombers he had no answer to. He looked at Rundstedt's plan and said, in effect, this will not work. The panzers will never reach the beach. They will be smashed on the road by Allied aircraft long before they even close with the landing force. The only chance is to defeat the invasion at the waterline within the first 24 hours, before they have a foothold, before they can build up, before our forces are pinned down and pounded from the sky. Rommel was right. Rundstedt was wrong. Air power had changed the math, and Rommel was the only senior German general who really understood it. But this was a Nazi command structure. Decisions were not made on the merits. They were made by Hitler, and Hitler presented with two strong opinions from two of his most senior generals. Did what he often did. He split the difference. He gave some panzers to Rommel for forward deployment. He kept others under his own personal control to be released only on his direct order. He pleased no one. He prepared a defense that could neither win at the beach nor counterattack inland. There was one more thing Rommel said. He said it to his staff in May 1944. Looking out at the Channel coast he was supposed to defend. The first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive, for the Allies as well as the Germans. It will be the longest day. That phrase, the longest day, would outlive him. There was in the end one more enemy nobody could plan for, the weather. Late May, early June 1944. The English Channel was a storm system, grey sky, wind, the kind of seas that would capsize a landing craft before it even reached the beach. The invasion was scheduled for June 5th, and the conditions on June 5th were impossible. Eisenhower postponed by 24 hours. The ships were already at sea. They had to turn around and go back, refuel in heavy seas, and try again. Then, on the night of June 4th, his chief meteorologist, a Scotsman named James Stagg, told him that there would be a narrow window, 36 hours of marginal but possible weather starting the morning of June 6th. After that, it would close again and stay closed for at least 2 weeks. Eisenhower listened to the forecast. He listened to his commanders. Montgomery said go. The naval commander said go. The air commander said wait. Eisenhower thought about it for some time in silence, and then he said very simply, okay, let's go. That decision, made in a small room at 3 in the morning by a man nobody had heard of 15 years earlier, sent 156,000 men toward the French coast. The German meteorologists had access to less data. They were not getting reports from the North Atlantic. It was full of Allied ships and convoys. They could not see what was coming. They looked at the weather over France, and they concluded that nobody could possibly invade in conditions like these. Rommel, who agreed with them, made a personal calculation. His wife's birthday was on June 6th. He had bought her a pair of shoes in Paris. Since he didn't see her for a few months, he would then drive home to Germany for the weekend, give her the shoes, and be back at his headquarters by Monday. He was in Germany when the invasion came. The first men to arrive in France that night were not on boats. They were in the sky. Just after midnight on June 6, 1944, thousands of Allied paratroopers and glider troops began coming down into Normandy behind the German coastal defenses. Their mission was to seize bridges, knock out gun positions, and block roads, to slow the German response, to confuse the German command, and to give the seaborne forces a few extra hours of life when they hit the beach in the morning. It did not go according to plan. Almost nothing about the airborne phase went according to plan. And in some ways, that was the best thing that could have happened. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were dropped behind Omaha Beach in the western sector. It was a disaster by the standards of the planners. The transport pilots, most of them inexperienced and flying through the anti-aircraft fire for the first time, broke formation and scattered their men miles from the planned drop zones. Wind blew jumpers off course. They came down in flooded fields and drowned under the weight of their packs before they could cut their gear free. Some came down in trees and were shot hanging from the branches. Some came down in the middle of German garrisons and were dead within minutes of touching the ground. A paratrooper named John Steele of the 82nd landed on the church steeple of Sainte-Mère-Église and hung there. His parachute caught on the roof for 2 hours, listening to the battle going on in the square below. He survived. Most of the men in the square did not. But the catastrophe had a second phase. Because the drop was so scattered, German commanders trying to make sense of what was happening to them in the dark could not figure out where the Allied airborne forces actually were. Small groups of paratroopers, lost separated from their officers, found each other in the dark and started attacking anything that looked German. Reports flooded into German headquarters from a dozen different sectors. Paratroopers here, paratroopers there. A coordinated airborne assault by a single division, dropped accurately, would have appeared on the German maps as a single threat at a single location. The actual drop, scattered across hundreds of square miles, appeared on the German maps as a chaos of small fires no one could put out. By morning, the 82nd and 101st had taken most of their objectives, often with the wrong unit, often by accident, often by a sergeant deciding on his own that the bridge over there looked important and ought to be captured. To the east on the British and Canadian flank, the airborne operations were conducted with surgical precision. The British 6th Airborne Division, under Major General Richard Gale, sent gliders in to seize two crucial bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River, the eastern hinges of the invasion. The lead glider, piloted by a man named Jim Woolwork, slammed into the ground 47 yards from the bridge at almost 100 miles an hour. The Horsa broke up on impact. About 30 men climbed out into the dark, led by Major John Howard. Two more gliders came down behind them within minutes. Howard's force, about 90 men in 3 gliders, took the bridge in 10 minutes and held it through the day against repeated German counterattacks. The bridge later became known as Pegasus Bridge. It was the first piece of French soil the Allies took back from Germany. It was taken at 30 minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944, by men who had crashed into a field 2 minutes earlier and were by any reasonable definition still in shock. Dawn came at 5:30 in the morning. With it, the largest fleet ever assembled. Nearly 7,000 ships, naval bombardment from battleships and cruisers off the coast, air bombardment from thousands of bombers. The sky was full of aircraft. The sea was full of boats. And in the boats were the men, most of them seasick, most of them young, and most of them about to find out whether the plan was going to work. There were in total 5 beaches. Utah Beach in the west was the American 4th Infantry Division's responsibility. It went well. Strong currents pushed the landing craft a mile south of the planned location into a sector that was lightly defended. The senior officer ashore decided not to send his men back into the water to find the right beach. Utah took relatively light casualties. By the end of the day, it was firmly in American hands. Point Du Hoc between Utah and Omaha was a 100-foot cliff topped by what the planners believed were 6 powerful 155mm guns, capable of devastating both American beaches. A unit of U.S. Army Rangers, the 2nd Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, was assigned to scale the cliff under fire and destroy them. They climbed the cliff with grapples and ropes, took casualties at every step, and reached the top to find the emplacements empty. The Germans had moved the guns inland weeks earlier and replaced them with telephone poles. The Rangers found the real ones a mile away, abandoned, and blew them up. Of the 225 Rangers who started the assault, fewer than 90 were still standing by the end of the second day. Omaha Beach was the disaster. Omaha was the American 1st Infantry Division's beach, with elements of the 29th Division. It was the only landing area where almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The beach itself was the worst piece of geography of the entire invasion front, a long crescent of sand backed by steep bluffs rising 150 feet, with only a few narrow draws cut through them, every one of which the Germans had carefully sighted with machine guns and mortars. Allied intelligence had identified a second-rate German static division defending the sector. The unit actually there was the 352nd Infantry Division, a veteran formation, full strength, recently moved into the area and not on the Allied maps at all. The naval and aerial bombardments overshot. And then the DD tanks. DD stood for duplex drive. They were Sherman tanks fitted with an inflatable canvas screen and 2 propellers, launched from landing craft offshore and swim to the beach under their own power, with their 5-man crews sealed inside. The idea was that they could arrive on the sand at the same moment as the infantry and provide fire support against the German positions on the bluffs. The canvas screen would drop and the tank would drive ashore as a fighting vehicle. That was the plan. At Omaha, the launch went terribly wrong. That was the plan. At Omaha, the launch went terribly wrong. The 741st Tank Battalion put its DDs in the water more than 3 miles offshore, in seas much rougher than anything the tanks had been tested in. The canvas screens collapsed under the weight of the waves. Water came in faster than the pumps could clear out. The tanks sank. Over 29 launched, only 2 reached the beach. 27 went to the bottom of the channel with most of their crews still inside. The men in the landing crafts watched while they sank down. When the rams dropped on the beach, the German machine guns opened fire immediately. Some boats took mortar fire that landed inside them and killed every man before they even reached the sand. Within 10 minutes, the first wave was effectively destroyed. Companies that had landed with 200 men at full strength were reduced to 20 or 30. Wounded soldiers crawling for cover behind beach obstacles. Officers were singled out and shot. Radios were singled out and shot. The battle plan, which depended on coordinated movement off the beach within 30 minutes, disintegrated in the first 10. For most of the morning, the men on Omaha were not advancing. They were dying. It was here that the photographer Robert Capa took the most famous combat pictures of the war. A small set of graining images of soldiers crawling through the surf under fire, 11 frames that survived a darkroom accident in London. The rest of the roll was lost. Kappa later said the camera had been shaking too much. He was 30 years old. He had landed with the first wave. By mid-morning, General Bradley, watching offshore from the USS Augusta, was seriously considering pulling his men off Omaha and redirecting follow-on waves to Utah or the British beaches. If he had done it, if Omaha had been abandoned, there would have been a 15-mile gap between Utah and the British sector, with nothing in it but Germans. The whole invasion might have come apart. What saved Omaha in the end was not the plan. It was small groups of men, on their own initiative, deciding that staying on the beach was death and that the only chance was to go forward. Sergeants who pushed their squads up the bluffs through gaps in the German wire. Junior officers, many killed in the process, who organized improvised assaults on the German strongpoints. Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant, the fire support commander, watching the slaughter from offshore, signaled his ships, "Get on them. They're raising hell with the men on the beach, and we can't have any more of that." Destroyers ran in to within 8,000 yards of the beach, in some cases less. Several grounded briefly on sandbags trying to get closer. They fired their main guns point blank at German machine gun nests on the bluffs, with American infantry sometimes a few hundred meters below the target. It was dangerous to the destroyers, dangerous to the men on the sand, and almost certainly what saved the beach. By early afternoon, small breakthroughs were happening at multiple points along Omaha. By evening, a tenuous line had been pushed perhaps a mile inland. The coast was something like 2,400 American casualties on a single beach in a single morning. By far the worst losses of the invasion. It was a victory only in the sense that the beach was, at the end of the day, in American hands. By any other measure, what had happened on Omaha was a catastrophe survived by sheer individual courage. To the east, on Gold Beach, the British 50th Division landed against fierce but manageable resistance and pushed several miles inland by nightfall. On Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Division took heavy casualties in the first wave, close to Omaha proportions in the opening minutes, but recovered quickly and by the end of the day had pushed the furthest inland of any of the 5 beaches. The Canadians, who had been written off by the British planners as second-string troops, were the only force to come within sight of their D-Day objectives. On Sword Beach, the easternmost landing, the British 3rd Division got ashore in good order and linked up with the airborne forces holding the bridges over the Orne. In the afternoon, the German 21st Panzer Division, the only German armored formation in a position to react quickly, launched a counterattack against Sword and nearly getting within a few miles of the beach. Then their officers looked up, saw Allied gliders coming in overhead, bringing reinforcement to the airborne forces, assumed they were about to be cut off, and ordered a withdrawal. They were not actually about to be cut off. They could have kept attacking, but the moment passed, the order was given, and the panzers pulled back. There was the one German counterattack on June 6 that came close to changing the outcome. It fell apart because of a misread sky. The reason there were no other German counterattacks worth speaking of comes back to the panzer Hitler had kept under his personal control. When the first reports of the airborne drops reached German headquarters, the staff officers on duty understood almost immediately that this was the real thing. The panzer reserves needed to move, now, to the coast, before the Allies could establish themselves. But the divisions in question, the 12th SS, the Panzer Lehr, were under direct Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, which were under Hitler personal command staff, separate from the regular army chain of command. They could only be released on his authority. Now, Hitler was asleep at the Berghof, His chief of operations, General Alfred Jodl, refused to wake him. The Pas-de-Calais deception was still working. As late as midday on June 6, the German High Command was not yet sure whether Normandy was the real invasion or a feint. Releasing the armored division now would commit it in the wrong place, so Jodl held back. The order sat on Hitler's desk unsigned while the Allied forces grew. When Hitler finally woke up around noon, he convinced himself briefly that Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. He held the panzers back. By the time the release order was given and the divisions began to move, it was late afternoon. By the time they were actually on the road, it was evening. By the time they got close to the front, it was dark, which meant they could move under the cover of night. Because in daylight, the Allied fighter bombers owned the sky and would have destroyed them on the road, exactly as Rommel had predicted. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Jugend, did not reach the front in time to contest the landings. None of the Panzers Reserve did. The Hitler Jugend was a fanatical formation. The division had been built 2 years earlier from the Hitler Youth. Average age 17 in combat, raised on Nazi ideology since childhood. Membership in the Hitler Youth had been compulsory from every German boy of 10 and over since 1936. These teenagers had never known a school that was not Nazi, or a Germany that was not at war. In the weeks after D-Day, they would commit some of the worst atrocities of the campaign, most notoriously at the Ardennes Abbey, where Canadian prisoners of war were murdered. They were not the only German formation to do so. Wehrmacht units and other SS divisions also killed civilians and prisoners in Normandy. The Hitler Jugend were the most fanatical, not the only guilty. They would also fight harder than most German formations in the West. By the end of June 6, 1944, the Allies had put roughly 156,000 men ashore. They had taken about 10,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing across all 5 beaches. Roughly 4,400 of those were dead. They held 5 separate beachheads, none of them yet linked, all of them shallow. It was a foothold, not a victory. Rommel, racing back from Germany where the news reached him, arrived at his headquarters that night. He understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. He had told Hitler that the battle would be decided in the first 24 hours. The first 24 hours had come and gone, and the Allies were still ashore. Everything from this moment onward would be a fighting retreat dressed up as a defense. If you had asked any of the senior planners of Overlord in May of 1944 how long it would take to break out of the Normandy beachhead and begin the campaign into the interior of France, most of them would have said weeks, a month at most. The plan called for the city of Caen, the major communications hub of Lower Normandy, to fall on D-Day itself. Caen did not fall on D-Day. It did not fall in June, it did not fall in most of July. It took almost 2 months. The problem was the ground. Nobody in all the months of planning had really studied the ground. Normandy is one of the oldest farmed regions of Western Europe. Over the centuries, the farmers had divided their fields with hedgerows, not the small ornamental hedges of English suburbs, but earth banks of 4 or 5 feet, topped with thick growth of thorn and bramble, planted at the edge of every field, lining every lane. The locals called them les bocages. In some areas, there were thousands of these hedgerows per square mile. They had been built originally to mark property lines and keep livestock in. They turned out to be, by accident, one of the most formidable defensive landscapes in Europe. Every field was a fortress, every lane was a kill zone. A German machine gun positioned in the corner of a hedgerow could dominate 3 or 4 small fields. To take the machine gun, you had to assault uphill across an open meadow, climb an earth bank you could not see over, push through a tangle of brush, and then engage the gun crew at close range. Then you had to do it again, and again, and again. Every 200 yards, Allied tanks could not get through the hedgerows. They could climb the banks, but climbing them exposed their thin belly armor to the Panzerfausts waiting in the next hedge. A Panzerfaust was a cheap disposable rocket launcher carried by every German infantryman. It could kill a Sherman tank from across a single field. The Sherman, which was supposed to be the spearhead of the breakout, became almost useless. The infantry was on its own. Bradley, when he understood what his men were up against, said something that should be remembered. He said, "We had read about the Normandy hedgerows, but we had never appreciated them." That is one way of putting it. The other way of putting it is that the planners of the Overlord operation had walked their men into a battlefield nobody had studied and nobody had prepared them for. The men paid the bill. It took weeks of grinding combat at the cost of thousands of casualties before someone solved the problem. That someone was a sergeant in the US 2nd Armored Division named Chris Cullen. He had the idea of welding steel prongs onto the front of a Sherman tank cut from scrap salvaged from German beach obstacles. They let the tank punch directly through the base of a hedgerow rather than climb over it. The modified Shermans became known as rhinos. Eventually, hundreds of them were built. They began to move again. Cullen was not the only soldier working on the problem, but his version was the one that got built. For that, the army gave him a Legion of Merit. A sergeant with a welding torch and scrap metal, solving the problem the entire Allied command had failed to anticipate. While the Americans were learning le bocage in the western sector, the British and Canadians were tied down at Caen. Caen was Montgomery's responsibility. Montgomery had promised it on day 1. By day 30, it did not fall. By day 50, he had not fallen. He became instead the anchor of the German defense, the place where the Germans concentrated their panzer divisions, including the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, the Panzerlehr, and the 21st Panzer. Caen was where the German armor was and where Montgomery's forces were trying to break through. The British launched a series of operations through June and July to take Caen or break through into the open country below. Each one was met by ferocious German resistance. The British took casualties they could not afford. The Germans took more in armor and infantry that could not be replaced. Allied bombers attacked Caen itself. They flattened it. The medieval heart of the city, the cathedral district, the residential quarters, gone. French civilian casualties from the bombing of Caen ran into the thousands. Many of the dead had refused to evacuate. They had not believed their own city would be the target. They were the ones who had trusted the Allies most. The bombs did not know that. The Germans held the rubble anyway. Many of them were boys of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend. They took casualties at rates no regular formation could have absorbed. They lost roughly half their strength in the fighting around Caen. Their replacements were younger. Some of the prisoners taken from the divisions by the end of the campaign were 16 years old. Historians have argued for decades about whether Montgomery, having failed to take Caen on the schedule he promised, retroactively reframed the British effort as a deliberate strategy, pinning German armor in the east while the Americans broke out in the west. The argument is plausible. The bulk of the German panzers were tied to the British front and the American sector was thin. But it is also a lot more comfortable than the alternative, that the original plan had failed and the outcome happened to redeem it. The British and Canadians paid a terrible price in front of Caen for 2 months. The Germans paid a worse one. By the end of July, the German line was so weakened by the fighting at Caen that when the Americans hit them in the west, it broke. By then, the Allies had advanced only a few dozen miles inland. They had taken over 100,000 casualties. The newspapers at home were starting to ask quiet questions. The mood at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was grim. This is when the front breaks. Operation Cobra was Bradley's plan. It was simple, it was brutal, it worked. The idea was to concentrate everything on a narrow front, a few miles of German line west of Saint-Lô, and to saturate that front with bombing on a scale the Western Front had never seen. Then, through the gap blown in the German position, to send everything that rolled, Shermans, half-tracks carrying mechanized infantry, self-propelled artillery, the full weight of the American Armored Division held in reserve for exactly this moment, as fast as the roads would carry it, through the line into the open country and let the breakout run. The bombing took place on July 25th. Nearly 1,500 American heavy bombers dropped roughly 3,000 tons of explosives on a strip of French countryside about 7,000 yards long and 2,500 yards deep. The Panzer Lehr Division, which had been holding the sector, one of the best equipped divisions in the German army, was effectively annihilated as a fighting force. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, reported afterwards that his front lines looked like a landscape on the moon. At least 70% of his men, he wrote, were dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. The bombing also killed Americans. A significant number of bombs fell short of the target line and landed on the American positions. The dead included Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the senior American officer in Europe to be killed by friendly fire during the war. Around 111 American soldiers were killed by their own Air Force on July 25th. Several hundred more were wounded. The 30th Infantry Division took the worst of it. There are accounts of American soldiers firing rifles at their own bombers in fury as the strike continued. The ground attack went in on schedule. Some units stepped off shaken and below strength. By July 27th, American armor was moving through the gap. By July 30th, the German line west of Saint-Lô was no longer a line. It was holes connected by retreating men. On August 1st, Patton's Third Army was officially activated. It had been kept in reserve in England and shipped over secretly, partly to keep him out of the public eye after his various headline-making indiscretions, partly to keep the Fusag deception alive. Patton drove south, then east. The advance went from miles per week to miles per hour. Within 10 days, American spearheads had reached the Loire and were swinging east toward the Seine. It was at this moment, with the Western Front collapsing, that Hitler made the decision that would destroy his armies in Normandy. He had been advised by every senior commander still standing that the only rational move was a fighting withdrawal across the Seine. Get the divisions back beyond a major river barrier, regroup, and form a new line. Hitler refused. He ordered instead a counterattack. The remaining German panzer divisions in Normandy were to drive west, to the sea, to cut the American breakthrough at its base. The counterattack was launched at Mortain on August 7th. It failed within 48 hours. Allied air power devastated the German columns. The American defense was held by the 30th Infantry Division, the same unit bombed by its own Air Force at Cobra 2 weeks earlier, surrounded on Hill 317 and refusing to break. The Germans called them Roosevelt's SS for how stubbornly they fought. The German armor was destroyed without ever reaching its objective, and in failing, the counterattack had left the entire German 7th Army deep inside a sack, with only one road out. That sack became known as the Falaise Pocket. By mid-August, 2 Allied pincers were closing on the German position. The Canadians and Poles drove south from the British sector, the Americans drove north and east. Between them was the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army. What was left of them? Trying to escape through a narrowing gap of perhaps 15 miles, then 10, then 5. the gap stayed open longer than it should have. There is an old argument about whether the Allies could have closed it earlier and whether more Germans could have been bagged inside. What happened was that the German army inside the pocket, men, horses, tanks, trucks, artillery, supply columns, was attacked from the air for days on end. Allied fighter bombers flew sortie after sortie. The roads inside the pocket became choked with burning vehicles, dead horses, dead men. The Wehrmacht of 1944 was still heavily horse-drawn. On every truck that burned, there were 5 or 6 horses screaming on the ground. The roads could not be cleared because clearing them required vehicles, and the vehicles were on fire. Whole columns were destroyed. They were destroyed in place because there was nowhere for them to go. The gap was closed, finally on August 21st. Eisenhower walked on the pocket a few days later. He wrote afterwards, "It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh." He had spent the war up to that point in headquarters briefings and meetings. He had not seen the killing up close. He saw it at Falaise. The German Army Group B was effectively destroyed, 6,000 prisoners taken inside the pocket, tens of thousands killed. 2 field armies that had been the backbone of the German position in France no longer existed as fighting formations. What escaped across the Seine in the following days was a fraction. Beaten men without their equipment, retreating into Germany at the speed of their own legs. Paris was open. Paris had been open in a sense for days. The official Allied plan had been to bypass Paris. The city was politically valuable but militarily a distraction. Eisenhower wanted to push for the German border without getting bogged down in a long urban fight for a long humanitarian operation feeding the population. But the situation inside the city forced his hand. The French resistance had risen on August 19. There was fighting in the streets. There was a risk of a massacre. And there was a risk that the Soviets or the French communists or some combination of forces nobody wanted would arrive in Paris before any other authority did. So Eisenhower changed his mind. The 2nd French Armored Division under Philippe Leclerc, Free French Forces, the men who had fought their way through North Africa to be there, was given the honor of leading the entry. They entered the city on August 25, 1944. The German military governor of Paris was a general named Dietrich von Choltitz. Hitler had ordered him several days earlier to destroy the city, to dynamite the bridges, to burn the major monuments, to leave Paris a ruin worthy of the Dead Reich. Choltitz fortunately did not carry the order out. Whether there was conscience or calculation, or simply that he lacked the demolitions or the manpower to destroy a city the size of Paris with the forces he had left, historians still argue. Instead, he surrendered it. He signed the surrender at a hotel near the Gare Montparnasse on the afternoon of August 25th and went into Allied captivity. Paris was intact. The next day, Charles de Gaulle, the man who had refused to accept the surrender of France in 1940, who had spent 4 years arguing with everyone above and below him about who really represented the legitimate French state, walked down the Champs-Élysées at the head of a parade. The war in Western Europe was not over, but France was back. The numbers from Normandy are hard. They're hard because the sources do not agree and because the numbers themselves are larger than the human mind is built to comprehend. Allied casualties for the 12-week campaign, American, British, and Canadian forces, with smaller contingents of Polish and Free French, run somewhere between 210 and 226,000. Depending on whose accounting you trust, roughly 37,000 ground troops killed, another 16,000 airmen killed, and the rest wounded or missing. German casualties are harder to count, and the estimates vary wildly. The consensus figure for the campaign is somewhere between 290 and 400,000 total, killed, wounded, missing, and captured. Roughly 200,000 of those were prisoners taken during the breakout and the pursuit, including about 50,000 inside the Falaise pocket itself. 2 field armies destroyed. The Western Front, which had been a manageable holding action for 4 years, was now a collapsing line racing toward the Rhine. What kept the Allied side from collapsing in its own way was logistics. They had towed 2 artificial harbors across the channel, codenamed Mulberry, to feed the beachheads before a real port could be captured. One was destroyed in the June 19 storm. The other, at Arromanches, ran for the rest of the campaign and handled the tonnage that fed every advance from the Bocage to the Seine. The engineering kept up with the killing. That was the difference. And then there were the French civilian dead from the campaign, from the bombing of the Caen, from the bombing of Saint-Lô, from artillery fire in the towns and villages of Normandy, from the ground fighting that simply rolled over them, are estimated at around 20,000 in Normandy itself, and around 60,000 across the broader Allied bombing of France in 1944. These were the people the Allies had come to liberate. A great many did not live to see it. The honest accounting of Normandy includes them. It is too easy, looking back, to count only the men in uniform. The people of Normandy paid a bill nobody asked them to sign. So, what was it all for? What did Normandy actually decide? The temptation is to say it won the war. It did not. By June 1944, the strategic question of the war was no longer whether Germany would lose. Stalingrad in early 1943 and Kursk that summer had broken the Wehrmacht's offensive power in the east. The Red Army was now advancing into Poland. The Allied bombing campaign was grinding German industry one factory at a time. The U-boat war had been lost in 1943. Germany was finished. The only question was when and how and at what price. Normandy did not decide the war. The Eastern Front had already decided the war. Normandy decided the peace. That is the harder fact and the one worth holding on to. Without Normandy, the Red Army does not stop at the Elbe. It pushes further west, possibly to the Rhine, possibly beyond. Western Europe does not become Western Europe in any sense we would recognize. There is no NATO, there is no Marshall Plan, there is no West Germany, there is no European Union, eventually because the political map that produces those things does not exist. The Cold War would have happened anyway, but the line of that war, the place where one system ended and the other began, would have been drawn somewhere very different. That is what was being decided on those beaches, not whether Germany lost, whether the world we live in now was going to be possible. The men who made it possible. Rommel never lived to see the end. He was implicated on circumstantial evidence in the July 20th plot to kill Hitler, the assassination attempt by senior German officers in 1944. Whether he was actually part of it is still argued. What is certain is that Hitler decided he was. In October 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's house outside Ulm with a vial of poison. They told him he had a choice. He could take the poison, in which case his family would be untouched and he would be buried as a national hero, or he could face the People's Court, in which his family could be sent to a camp under Sippenhaft, the Nazi practice of punishing the families of state enemies, and he would be hanged. Rommel took the poison. The Reich announced he had died of wounds suffered in France. He was given a state funeral with full military honors. His widow understood what had happened, so did his son. So did everyone close to him. The lie was for the German public, who needed to believe their most popular general had not been murdered by his own government. Eisenhower came home a national hero. He was elected President of the United States in 1952 and served 2 terms. The note in the wallet, the one he had written on June 5th in case the invasion failed, was eventually framed. He kept it for the rest of his life. He told the story rarely. When he told it, he was clear about one thing. He had meant it. There is one last thing to do, and it's the one thing that we always do at the end of these episodes. We ask what would have happened if any one of the small decisions had gone the other way. The frame is the same as always, not large strategic counterfactuals, small ones, moments where a single decision, a single hour, a single break of weather could have changed everything. The road not taken. For Normandy, 3 of them stand out. The first one, what if the weather had been worse? Eisenhower's decision on the night of June 4th was made on a window of 36 hours. The forecast for the period after that was uniformly terrible. The next viable combination of tides, moonlight, and channel weather was June 19. The one after that, mid-July. If Eisenhower had postponed by 2 weeks, the invasion fleet would have been at sea, or assembling for sea, during the worst channel storm of the entire summer. The Great Storm of June 19 to 22nd, which struck after the actual invasion and destroyed one of the 2 Mulberry artificial harbors that had been towed across the channel to supply the beachhead. The storm hit on the exact date of the next viable window. If he had caught the invasion fleet itself mid-crossing, the operation would have been a catastrophe. Ships swamped, landing crafts scattered, men drowned in numbers we cannot calculate. The invasion almost certainly would not have happened in 1944, pushed into 1945 while the Red Army continues to roll west. The political map in the end of the war looks completely different. The Soviets reach the Rhine first, possibly further. Where the line settles, nobody can say. The window Eisenhower took was 36 hours. He took it because there was not going to be another one. Our second counterfactual, what if the Germans had not been fooled by fortitude? The largest concentration of German force in France was the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais. 20 some divisions, including significant armor, they sat on the wrong beach for the entire critical period of the campaign because German intelligence was still convinced by the deception and by their own preconceptions about what an Allied invasion should look like, that Normandy was a feint and that the real blow was still coming at Calais. If they had moved in the first week of the invasion, if Hitler had personally ordered the 15th Army to abandon Calais and reinforce Normandy, the beachhead would not have held. The Allied forces ashore were not configured to absorb a counterattack of that weight. On top of the German divisions they were already fighting. The Allies would have been pushed back into the sea. Churchill, who had agonized over the invasion for years, precisely because he feared this exact outcome, would have survived it politically by inches. Roosevelt would have had to explain a defeat of unprecedented scale during an election year. The war in Western Europe would have been set back by at least a year and possibly longer. By the time the Allies were ready to try again, the Soviets would have been deep into Germany. Fortitude was the most elaborate and the most expensive deception of the war. It was also the most valuable thing the Allies did before June 6th. It was certainly worth more than any single division on the ground. Number 3. What if the panzers had moved at dawn? The German panzer reserves were positioned to intervene. They were in the right place. The roads from their assembly areas to the coast were clear in the early morning, before Allied air power had fully established itself. If Jodl had pushed for early release, or if local commanders had been given the authority to act on their own, or if the German High Command had recognized Normandy immediately as the real attack, rather than a possible feint, the panzers reached the beaches by mid-morning. The British and Canadian sector, where the airborne forces had not yet linked up with the seaborne forces, would have been the obvious target. The 12th SS, the Panzer Lehr, and the 21st Panzer all aimed at the seam between Sword and Juno, with the bridges at Pegasus and the beaches behind them as the objective. The British paratroopers around Pegasus Bridge hold on against everything thrown at them by infantry. They do not hold on against 3 panzer divisions arriving at noon. The eastern beaches collapse. The whole landing unravels from the flank inward. By nightfall on June 6, the Allies have a problem on Omaha and a disaster on Sword, with everything in between exposed. It did not happen because fortitude was still working. The German command made a deliberate choice based on a deception that turned out to be total. By the time they were sure the panzers could no longer move in daylight, and the men on the beaches had a foothold. It is one of the strangest pivots in the history of war. In closing, this is the last battle of our modern arc on the channel. Marne, Stalingrad, Normandy. 3 battles, 30 years apart. The first Marne, in September 1914, condemned Europe to 4 years of industrial slaughter. It produced the political collapse of the old continental order, the rise of the Soviet Union, the bitterness that gave Germany National Socialism. Most of what went wrong in the 20th century traces back to that first month of the First World War. Stalingrad, 28 years later, decided who would win the catastrophe that the Marne had made possible. It broke the German army on the Eastern Front. It tipped the balance of the Second World War from a war Germany might still have won into a war Germany was going to lose. Normandy, 16 months after Stalingrad, decided who would clean it up. Everything else in the 20th century, the Cold War, the partition of Germany, the rebuilding of Europe under the Marshall Plan, the post-war economic miracle, the alliances that still shape the world today, was being decided on those beaches in June and July of 1944. That is what makes Normandy consequential, not the scale, not the heroism, even if that mattered the most, but not the spectacle. The map of the world we live in was being drawn while those men were dying. Normandy is also the last battle of the series. 16 battles, from Marathon to here. Next week, the final episode. We will look back at all of it, and we will ask what we found. Thank you very much for following up, and if you made it this far, and I will see you next time to our last episode. Bye.